Because I turn your attention next to a report from Human Rights Watch, the US-based group that does exactly what it says on the tin, and their latest investigation into so-called evacuation orders being pursued to facilitate the, quotes, deliberate and massive forced displacement of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Nadiah Hardman is a refugee and migrant rights researcher at Human Rights Watch and the author of this report. Nadiah, tell me more.
Thanks for having me in your program. It's a pleasure to be here. I spent the last year working with colleagues at Human Rights Watch to unpack and essentially debunk Israel's claim that it is evacuating people safely in Gaza. We analyzed over 184 evacuation orders, basically looking at the entire evacuation system.
What is, just explain to me what an evacuation order is. I mean, I'm not completely stupid. I appreciate that the language is probably quite self-explanatory, but if I got one, what would that involve me having to do?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, they're basically instructions to leave. So the Israeli military have been disseminating leaflets, text messages across the Gaza Strip. And so, on the face of it, it looks like it's giving people ample warning to leave areas because there are going to be imminent hostilities. And so, we started to look at this and to really understand, is this an appropriate evacuation system? There's laws around this. The laws of war say an occupying power, such as Israel, can move people, but it has to be for their safety, and there has to be an imperative military reason, and you have to give them time to move, and you have to move them safely through evacuation routes that are safe and to evacuation places that are safe. And instead, what we found is a horrifying disaster of abuses. And when it comes to the actual evacuation orders, they were inconsistent. They were erroneous. They didn't give people enough time to move. You'll probably remember the October 13 order, which gave people initially just 24 hours to move. That's over 1 million people from the north to the south. Then what we've seen throughout the conflict are just a series of orders which made no sense and just sowed terror and confusion in the population. And then if you add to this the humanitarian situation, and again, international law says, if you want to evacuate people, you have to give them food and water and shelter. And instead, what we've seen is Israel using starvation as a weapon of war. We've seen how safe zones rapidly change. The Al-Mawasi humanitarian safe zone, this area which Israel keeps on telling people to go to, has changed its boundaries at least 14 times. And we've verified attacks in these safe zones. And then one safe zone suddenly becomes a combat zone. We know nowhere is safe in Gaza. And maybe the most important element of the war crime of forced displacement is the fact that Israel is rendering the Gaza Strip uninhabitable, either through reckless bombing and its air campaign, or through intentional razing and bulldozing of buildings and areas. And in those spaces where we see these new security corridors, a buffer zone, a road which now bifurcates the north and the south of Gaza, they're just emptied spaces. And this is where we say that Israel has ethnically cleansed Palestinians from these areas.
And as I alluded to shortly before you came on, some members of the Israeli military have come perilously close to conceding that publicly now. And I mean, reports that it is actually an established plan, albeit one that I think Benjamin Netanyahu's government still denies. If so, where is safe now in the Gaza Strip?
James, nowhere is safe in the Gaza Strip. There is, I think the Strip is now 84% under evacuation orders. If you imagine how many people,
so eventually you have 100% evacuation orders while still pretending that there's somewhere safe to go.
Right, exactly. Because if you have attacks consistently in these safe zones, and you spoke about the statements. I mean, we spent a lot of time analyzing the statements from the beginning of the war to now from senior officials, which is evidence of a state policy to forcibly displace. They've spelled this out. They've called for the voluntary migration of Palestinians in Gaza from outside the territory. So that is where we see evidence of a state policy and where it amounts to a crime against humanity. And I mean, it's important to always draw attention to what we're recommending. We're not just gathering this evidence. We recommend that the International Criminal Court's prosecutor add forced displacement, investigate forced displacement as a crime against humanity, and the prevention of the right to return. We also, of course, recommend that governments, including the UK, suspend military assistance and weapons transfers.
I mean, again, you have answered this question, but I feel I should ask it again. Return to what?
Exactly. I mean, the reality is there is nowhere to return to for the majority of the population. I mean, the destruction is just, it's unfathomable. In our report, we include graphics of satellite imagery, which display before and after. You're talking about agricultural lands, greenhouses, hospitals, schools, universities. People, how are people meant to live their lives even once, and hopefully if this war ends, there is not much to return to. And the UN has estimated it will cost 40 to 50 billion dollars to rebuild in an effort not seen since the Second World War. And of course, we call for reconstruction, but we are very cognizant of the fact that this is a state policy to move people intentionally from their homes.
And an illustration once again, of course, of the compounding of the situation by Israel's refusal to let foreign journalists into the territories concerned, because, of course, we would rather not be relying on drone footage and overhead cameras.
Absolutely.
There are many brave men and women who would like nothing more than to get there now with their notebooks and their cameras.
Absolutely. I mean, we had to do this entire report, which is why it took such a long time remotely. I spent hours, days trying to get people that were charging their phones, who were running away from various battlegrounds, just to get the interviews that we needed. And, we used all this open source technology, and there are so many brave journalists and people getting the information out there. But it's really tough. But we've amassed so much evidence. It's 154 pages of evidence, plus graphics and satellite imagery that's irrefutable. And of course, we've put these allegations or this evidence to the Israeli authorities, but we have not received a reply.
For people who need a little bit of help grasping the bigger picture, I don't know that you will have much to say about this, but I want to get it out into the same space as this conversation, because Donald Trump's nomination for the US ambassador to Israel, although not Jewish, which breaks precedent, has said that there is no such thing as a Palestinian. He's described the Palestinian issue as simply a political tool to try to force land away from Israel. How significant is the change of administration on the horizon in Washington, given those words?
Look, I don't want to preempt what
Sure.
hasn't happened, right? I
Fair.
don't want to preempt. I don't want to predict. At the same time, Biden gave a 30-day deadline for more humanitarian trucks to enter the Gaza Strip, and that has woefully failed. And we've seen no consequence. The Biden administration can right now, before President-elect Trump comes into power, do something, and that is in the form of suspending military assistance and weapons transfers. It's as simple as that. It's publicly condemning these war crimes as for what they are, crimes against humanity. We'll wait and see what happens, but we're focused on what can happen now, because the messages I receive from people are devastating. Every day they update me and say, "Oh, well, I'm still alive," and the urgency cannot be translated more.
The clear blue water between what was stated towards the end of last year and what is happening now is clear to anybody honest. But if somebody were to argue that this is a necessary consequence of the tireless pursuit of Hamas terrorists, what would your evidence offer up in challenge to that view?
Sure. I think, one of the things about this war crime of forced displacement, when you arbitrarily move people, is there is such a high threshold. Usually in the laws of war, you can conduct yourself according to military necessity. The standard in this war crime is there has to be an imperative military reason to move people. There must be no other feasible alternative. And so what we've shown is that in each of these instances that Israel has said it has to move people, it hasn't demonstrated the alternatives. It hasn't done any of that.
Right.
These claims are largely false.
Thank you, Nadiah Hardman, a refugee and migrants' rights researcher at Human Rights Watch and the author of this report, which you can read more about on their website or indeed in The Guardian. And The Guardian has contacted the Israeli army for comment, although at the time of this conversation, no comment has been forthcoming.